Good afternoon. It's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's another hot Monday afternoon in June here in Florida. I'm heading off to some cooler temperatures in a few weeks to visit my home state of Virginia. Here over the last few months, my reading has taken me to the Renaissance, and I've spent a good bit of time on the continent, in France and Germany, in England, all over the UK, Scotland. I was trying to think where Basel is, Switzerland. So I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about some of the books that I've been reading and some of the fascinating stuff that comes up as we look at history. Because certainly this craft that we are involved in, especially needlework, of all of the handmade products that we can talk about, has figured very prominently in the history and the imagery that we have from the Renaissance. I received a book for my birthday that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, but it led me down the path to a little journey and I found myself, as I say, mostly in Renaissance England. Before I start down the history trail, I'll mention that this book that I've talked about before, Threads of Life by Claire Hunter, was one of the things that spurred me on. Chapter 2 of her book is entitled Power. And in that section, she spends just a little bit of time talking about Mary, Queen of Scots, who, if you know anything about English and Scottish history, you know she was a very significant and powerful woman figure. But also from the standpoint of those of us who do needlework, she's important because it's well known that she used stitching and embroidery and needlework both as part of the power that she maintained as queen and also as a personal kind of way of dealing with her sorrows and troubles. Mary was born a queen. She was sent off to France at the age of 5 to be married to the heir apparent to the French throne. She came back to Scotland as an older teenager as the Queen of Scotland. And as you can imagine, in the 1500s, a young woman, queen or not, encountered all sorts of barriers and troubles. Her cousin was Queen Elizabeth I of England. Mary had hoped that she and Elizabeth would have a friendship. It didn't turn out that way, and if you know the end of the history of Mary, Queen of Scots, you know that she was beheaded in the Tower of London by her cousin Queen Elizabeth because there was a fear that she might threaten the throne of England. That's just a little bit of a kind of a history overview, but what is so interesting is how needlework and embroidery is intertwined in all that. I have seen, I don't have any in the shop right now, but I suspect they're still available. I've seen some patterns and some kits that recreate some of the earliest needlework that Queen Elizabeth I did when she was a young girl. That might be something, if those of you who really enjoy history are interested in, you could snoop around and see if you could find that. I'm pretty sure I had one here in the shop at one point, but I believe that it's probably sold now. So Queen Elizabeth was a stitcher. Mary, Queen of Scots, as I'm going to talk about in a little more detail, was a stitcher. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, who was Queen Elizabeth I's mother, and was also beheaded as part of our little history lesson here, brought black work from Spain over to the United Kingdom. I did find a wonderful little pattern here in my collection that is a 17th century pomegranate done in black work. Another book that I read recently was about the painter Hans Holbein, and I know this sounds confusing, but there really is a stream to drag all this stuff together. Hans Holbein from Basel, Switzerland, originally from Germany, was the court painter for Henry VIII. And the reason we know a lot about the needlework from that period, from Henry VIII and later Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, is because the type of painting that Hans Holbein perfected during that time. The word verisimilitude describes what he tried to do. He was probably one of the first that you really would take notice of that attempted to paint persons almost in a photographic way. And honestly, if you go back and look at some of the paintings that Hans Holbein did, both in England and when he was over on the continent, some of them are so striking that they really do look like photographs. One of the most famous ones, or many of the famous ones, are around the British court, and that famous picture of chubby Henry VIII with all the fine royal garb that he had on was painted by Hans Holbein. If you look closely in those paintings, the ones that Holbein did, you will see black work, you'll see gold embroidery, you'll see some of the fabulous stitching that went on during that time. It's hard for me, and it's hard for any of us to imagine how important embroidery and how expensive and valuable it was during that time, especially for those persons of means, like those who were associated with the courts of the various kings and kingdoms in Europe. Embroiderers were some of the most valued people in the kingdom. Their work was highly sought after. The really good embroiderers were paid a lot of money. Their status was very important. So what I got from reading the biography of Hans Holbein, other than learning a lot about the art that he produced, was something about the status of embroidery and stitching at that time. Now, you know, later on, as fabrics began to be dyed and as machinery began to produce fabric and things like that, the handwork that was so very, very valuable during the Renaissance began to lessen in value. And in some ways, it kind of became, in a derogatory way, called women's work, or less important kind of stuff. That's where Claire Hunter comes in, because I think she takes a fascinating look, both in the first book, Threads of Life, and in the one that I'm reading now, about how women have used embroidery to express themselves, to suggest things that are important to them in their lives and the lives of women, and that there is still probably, and there certainly was, some real power in that handwork that was done. A couple of other books I've mentioned to you that you might want to pick up on if you're interested in this whole dynamic of stitching and power. There's a book called The Subversive Stitch by Rosika Parker, which is a really good look at embroidery and how women might have used the very subtle art of embroidery to make points and to gain attention. Another one that I found really interesting is called The Resilient Stitch, which looks at stitching and some of the power that women, not always women, but often women have used to express themselves. Because face it, as we look back in history at a time like the Renaissance, other than a few women like Queen Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, women really had no place. Their lives were not chronicled. We don't know much about what they were good at, and it's hard to imagine that there were very many women who had the ability to live to their potential. Well, my youngest son is very astute, and he knows the kind of things that I love, and he was visiting Edinburgh, Scotland, a few months back, and he found Claire Hunter's new book, which I didn't even know existed. Embroidering Her Truth, Mary Queen of Scots and the Language of Power, really builds on chapter 2 of her first book and goes very much in depth into the history of Mary Queen of Scots, and not just the stitching that Mary herself did, but the use of embroidery and the use of stitching as she sought to work her way through the history of the relationship between England and Scotland and all the kind of terrible things that happened during that time. There are a couple things. I haven't finished the book. I'm only about halfway through, so I may have to do another episode when I'm done. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed Claire Hunter's works. I should get a royalty for bragging on her so much, but she's a vivid storyteller. She takes us back sometimes into memories of her own childhood, but then she always grounds it and comes back and looks at some really important aspects of history that we may not know much about. So her point in looking at this is to dig deeper into the history of Mary, the Queen of Scots, who's a very fascinating figure, as you've already heard me talk about, but also say something about the use of embroidery and handwork during that time. A couple of things that have really struck me as I've been reading so far. In that time, certain symbols manifest huge power. Not a lot of people were literate, even though the printing press had been invented by the 16th century. And the power of symbols, the idea that one king or one queen would have something as a symbol and another king might use something else, was a visual way of imposing power and authority. You know how Henry VIII had all those different wives as a part of his attempt to make sure that he had a male heir to ascend to the British throne. The different wives, when they came on the scene, often used embroidered symbols to show where they came from and to exert authority. I mentioned Anne Boleyn, who was Henry's second wife. He married her after having his first wife annulled and basically breaking away from the Catholic Church and the Pope. So there was a lot of big, important kind of stuff going on at that point. Anne Boleyn had come over from Spain, and as I mentioned, one of the things she brought to the court of Henry VIII was black work. And anytime she had the opportunity to express herself through her clothing, through the wall hangings in her bedrooms, anywhere that she used embroidery, she brought that black work as a symbol not only of just her, but also of her heritage. So when you look at some of that stuff, you don't have a sense of how potent it was, how useful it would have been to those women who were fighting for a place. You know, I guess we can look back and say now that to become a queen of Henry VIII was a pretty dangerous profession. He had 6 wives. The first one lived to be an old woman. None of the rest of them did, except maybe 6. I think she might have managed a while too. But Queen Elizabeth's own mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded when it was time for him to find a way to marry the 3rd wife. We won't go too much further into that, but this book, Embroidering Her Truth by Claire Hunter, gives you some really interesting insight, not just in symbols, but also in colors. Each kingdom used certain colors on its flag and to signify its power. Scotland was in a very vulnerable position when Mary was Queen of Scotland. They were in danger of being taken over by England, by France, by Spain, by just about anybody else who was around. If she were traveling or if she was in a place where ambassadors from other countries were present, it would be very important for her to use the Scottish colors. And I think I read in this book that this was before the commercial use of the tartans was as well known. I'm sure the tartans go way back. But just the use of colors, just the costumes or dresses that she might have worn were expressive of important things, important symbolism. The other fascinating thing, and this might be something you want to look into a little more too, especially those of you who are into dolls and doll dresses and that sort of thing, which is a fabulous handmade craft in itself. She talks about how in this period, this Renaissance period when I'm talking about, a lot of time kings and queens married each other for political reasons. So Henry VIII imported a couple of wives from the continent in order to forge alliances with other powerful figures in other parts of Europe. Well, let's say you're 14 years old and you know that you're going to be going to England and you're going to marry the king, but you don't know what to wear. There is no internet. There is no telephone. You know, you could have a portrait painted, but that would only be one example. How would you know, as a 14-year-old coming to become the queen of a nation, what sort of wardrobe you might need upon your arrival? Because, of course, first impressions would be very important. They devised a system where the embroiderers of the court, let's say of Henry VIII of England, would dress dolls in the latest fashions. And they've actually found some of these dolls. There's one in a museum somewhere in Northern Europe. I don't have the reference right this minute. But the embroiderers who were working on the latest fashions in the courts, let's say in Henry VIII's court, would dress dolls with the exact kind of fashion, the ruffs, the embroidered sleeves, the petticoats, all the sort of things that would be involved. And those would be sent over so that the woman who was going to be coming could have her own embroiderers and seamstresses and tailors in her own country create wardrobes. So before fancy dress-up dolls became something that girls played with, they were very serious political tools that were used to transmit information easily and more simply than any other way that was available to them at the time, so that a woman who could come into a strange situation could come in with some assurance that the fashions she wore were important. And just like any point in history, perhaps, it really was important that you looked the part, that you had the right clothes and the right colors and the right symbols that managed to carry that forward. So I just thought that was a real revelatory kind of section in this book. And as you think about the history of doll making and where dolls have come down through history, I'm sure there are other strands of dolls that were being made even then, but dolls would have been very expensive during the Renaissance. So I'm not thinking just about everybody had a doll. This is a fascinating little wrinkle to that whole discussion. The final thing that I'm coming to that I haven't got to in this book, but I've certainly seen references to in other works, is that when Queen Elizabeth finally did imprison Mary, Queen of Scots, and put her in the Tower of London, Mary continued to do stitching and needlework during that time. And that was for her not only a manifestation of her power, even though she was powerless and imprisoned, but I suspect it was a real comfort to her. It was a way that she could make the time pass, but also feel like she was creating something that might possibly survive after her death. I did find a couple really interesting tribute pieces that are here in the shop. I've got a great collection of vintage patterns. I've got about 12,000 vintage patterns in the back of the shop. And I found two in my collection that were done as tributes to Mary, Queen of Scots. There's a sampler here, and the photography is not very good on it, so you're not going to be able to see it in very great detail. But it's called Marie, a needlework tribute to Mary, Queen of Scots. It was made by Charlotte Designs in Toronto, Ontario in 1993. And it really is just taking symbols like the lion, the red lion, which was a symbol of Scotland, and putting them together in a needlework as a way of kind of remembering what Mary, Queen of Scots brought to the whole work that we love so much. Another one is made by Cobweb Designs in Berwickshire, Scotland. And again, it's not a recreation of something Mary, Queen of Scots did, but it's kind of a tribute piece that is a sampler that talks about the dramatic and tragic life that Mary, Queen of Scots lived. So those are some fun things that I have here in the shop, and I suspect there's some really other good, interesting stuff around. I hope that somebody has recreated some of the actual designs that were kept from Mary and Queen Elizabeth and others. You may have seen it recently. There's an article out on the web that talks about how needlework has undertaken a bit of a renaissance, and even Taylor Swift is excited about doing needlepoint at this point. I've heard tell that Queen Elizabeth II did some stitching. and I'm sure there are other royal figures in the modern times who have been interested in this. So that's I wanted to take you back with me for a few minutes to my little dabble in Renaissance history, and also again, just recommend any way I can the books by Claire Hunter, who is a very gifted Scottish writer, and I think if you pick up either of the books that I've mentioned today, you'll find them a good read. Well, that's enough time and enough babbling for today, but I hope you're enjoying some stitching during this summer weather. I know I've seen the Midwest and the Northeast are having some pretty extreme heat this week, so you guys are understanding what it feels like to be in Florida all summer, but hopefully the cool breezes will come along soon and you'll be able to relax again. As always, this is Gary Sly. Thanks for joining. It's the legacy of Handmade Objects.